Prepare.
Preparation.
Prepare.
Prepare more.
Prepared is being prepared.
Preparation.
Preparation.
Plan. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Deal Divas. Hi, I'm Siobhan.
I'm Annabel.
And I'm Anne.
And we are the Deal Divas, a podcast discussing all things negotiation. Today, we are going to be testing a few well-known sayings in relation to negotiating. So many of you will know the saying that is, fail to plan, plan to fail. Or when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So when it comes to negotiating, how true are these two sayings? If you fail to prepare, are you actually planning to fail in that negotiation? So starting us off, let's go to you, Annabel.
I think the big answer's got to be yes, but I would say that, wouldn't I? But then I think it's about the quality of preparation beyond just what it is that we do. And I sort of often think, yes, get a piece of paper out, darkened room, and off I go. I've got a big meeting coming up. And I think it's a case of very often people might look at the big and obvious stuff. Around what do I want, what do I need, where am I prepared to move to, etc. And I think the first thing it's worth perhaps talking about is the amount of emphasis we should be placing on really thinking about the other side and how they might be coming to the table, why they might be coming to the table, what is it that they want from me, and it probably leads into the second saying about assumptions. It's very easy to make assumptions and also equally easy not to bother to test them, if you like. And I think it was a simple example that I met a gentleman a few years ago now on a training course, and I was really struck by his sort of consternation as to why he was struggling to engage with his client in the way that he wanted to. And giving nothing away, the client was an airline and the person I was dealing with was selling tyres. And it was obviously putting all the thought process into how he wanted to, what volumes he wanted to achieve, how the account should be run, etc., etc. And yet was really struggling to get any kind of traction at all in this engagement. And then eventually he sort of said that what had happened was he'd finally got a decent conversation out of the buyer. And he said, but I want this strategic partnership, I want etc., etc. And the buyer in the end had to say to him, I'm going to have to stop you with this because in the great scheme of things, in the scheme of an aircraft, the tyre is nothing. The tyre is absolutely tiny in the scheme of things. So I don't want to engage with you in a strategic partnership. I just want to buy some tyres. And I'm going to buy a lot of tyres, but I don't need a strategic partnership. And I think some of that we perhaps don't do is to that level back to think about why are they engaging with me? How are they engaging with me? And am I delivering to them in the way that suits them? Because it's easy to look at everything from my side of the street, and if I want to sell 1 million tyres that year and that person might buy 1 million tyres, they are the biggest thing in my world. But potentially it's not the other way around. And I think it's really worth thinking about. That was my first kind of thought. I don't know if that strikes a chord with anyone.
Definitely. I used to work many years ago for an organization and with quite a reputation for particularly the sales force being quite aggressive. And we used to prepare, but every bit of preparation was about us. What do we want? How are we going to get it? How are we going to make them give us what we want? And then we would go into the negotiation and it would very quickly become quite combative. And part of the reason for the reputation that the sales force had was just because they hadn't given any consideration to the other side of the table. So, one of the things that we talk about on the course, I always talk to people about the importance of course, setting your own objectives and clarity around what you want to achieve and having, a game plan or 2 or 3 to enable you to achieve that. But also spending time thinking about, well, where are they coming from? What's important to them? Do they see you as a strategic partner, or do they just see you as a commodity purchase? What is it that kind of is important to them? Because without that, you're just trying to kind of squeeze your agenda across the table, which often isn't successful. And even if it is, I think it leaves a sour taste, almost like that these people are incredibly aggressive and difficult to negotiate with. In a long-term relationship, that's important, that matters.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I
yeah.
agree.
Definitely. And I used to work in a team where, not saying any names, but where the time pressure was such an issue that it was always the preparation that was pushed aside. And when we were facing challenges, with ongoing deals and partnerships, sometimes when we were pushing, like, let's actually prepare more, let's actually look at what didn't work, why didn't it work, there was quite a frustration around testing assumptions, because there was almost this attitude that these things are obvious. We that's just a given, and these presumptions are being made. There was a real pushback and slight offense to really pressure testing those assumptions and looking beyond, like you're saying, and looking beyond your own perspective
Mm,
and looking at the other side, considering things, outside factors that you may not expect. And there was a negotiation that we went into where there was just a completely different outside factor. We didn't realize that another competitor was suddenly bringing that product onto the market that they didn't have available before. So we just assumed that the status quo had stayed as it was, and we weren't open to testing that or considering that, because we'd just taken it as a fact. Well, it's been that way for this many years, so that's how it is. We don't have the time to be wasting considering how to position if that's the case. And because there was a tight timeline, that's why part of the team was pushing to say, we have to prepare as much as possible now, because the decision has to happen this week, otherwise we miss the opportunity. So we can't wait to have lots of adjournments and new meetings again and again. So it's just interesting, this
yeah.
sometimes the pushback you get if you do want to have more preparation time and value it, if you're in a company where the culture doesn't necessarily value that. And I wondered, like for you both, if you've had that sort of experience on how you've navigated that, if you've been in companies where they don't always value as much preparation time as you'd like.
I mean, for me, the time that the real kind of eye opener for me when I started teaching the course was this business about good negotiators plan for flexibility. And where I came from, good negotiators planned to, by hook or by crook, shoehorn their agenda, their perspective into the other side.
Yeah.
And this concept of good negotiators plan for flexibility, they think about good questions, try and understand what's important to the other side. They have creativity so that they can build richer deals. That was all a huge eye opener for me, because for me it was very, and the organization that I came from, thinking about potentially planning for flexibility would have been seen as a sign of weakness. I'm just asking for them to kind of get one over on me if I think that way. But
Yeah.
actually, yeah, it was a revelation to me, and I kind of I still drive it home on the course today.
Yeah. And one of the things I've seen working with lots of companies over the years is there's sort of a process whereby maybe you go to the potential customer with deal number one, and that's discussed, and then it's not going to be agreed by the salesperson. They're going to bring it back to some kind of pricing committee, which, thinking out loud, by definition suggests we're going to be haggling over this because this is the pricing committee. So we're here to discuss price, and that. So they come back with a recommendation of, I'll need to give X percent of discount. It gets discussed by the pricing committee. Back they go. They have a conversation. We move a bit more. We come back to the pricing committee, etc. And it's almost like they've built in that lack of flexibility. I'm flexing on the price, but not enough else, because there aren't enough questions asked by that pricing committee quite frequently of, well, where else are you going to make movement? Where else are you going to derive value? What am I going to get for my 5% additional discount you're asking me for? So the internal preparation that we do isn't structured in a way that brings almost negotiation to the table. It brings a haggle to the table, whereby the pricing committee give in to the lowest point that they think they need to in order to get agreement to the deal. And it's almost like sometimes that whole process is kind of baked into the management process of an organization.
Yeah.
And what it leads into is there's not enough thought given to, well, why are they engaging with us? Why is this company potentially going to buy from us? And what else can we ask of them, and what might we be prepared to bring to the table? It's a really narrow focus, I think, overall, really, that we can try and put some imagination behind and put some structure behind. Sometimes the process isn't there in the first place, so it's going to be even harder to find the time and the inclination if it's not something that's supported at a senior level right from the start. I'd be first question would be, well, if I give you another 2% to go to that customer, what am I getting in return for that 2%?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like the greatest value comes from that creativity. And the challenge is, if, like you said, if it isn't supported kind of on the management level, there's also other contributing factors that restrain things, like how people analyze and track the success of the deals and the profit margins. Because so often we were putting in data to analyze how well deals went, but it was based on volume, it was based on price, it was based on timeframes for invoicing or delivery. And it's like, it wasn't allowing any tracking of this other creativity to demonstrate value. So it was perpetuating this belief that we can only vary these factors to prove that we've got a strong deal, like you said, Anna, and not come across as weak. And therefore I feel like those sort of tracking systems and like KPIs don't support like creative preparation. And the creativity is where you get the most value, for sure. Definitely from my perspective.
And there are people that we come across when we teach the course that say, well, this is all very well, all this creativity, but my boss is saying to me, it's got to be about the price. So yeah, you're right, Siobhan. And I think a lot of sales teams, even a lot of buying teams, don't feel empowered by their organization to be more creative about how they build richer deals with creativity.
I agree. I think, and if you look at it sort of slightly, perhaps more I look at it now from a buying perspective, I don't think that people always come to the table with enough willingness to bring to the table, to trade at the table with the thing that the salesperson actually wants to get their hands on, which I know sounds obvious. And yet I'm thinking back to an example. This is some years ago now, but I went onto a call with this sort of the chief procurement person for an organisation that we were looking to sell quite a large number of courses into. And my boss was invited along as well. The two of us went in and we prepared in advance and we thought long and hard about what we'd do, etc., etc. And we were quite prepared for a bit of a beating, we thought. And essentially all we were given was, do you know who we are? This could be a really big deal. We said, that's lovely. That's great. How many courses do you think you might be interested in? Well, we're a really big name. And we said, yes, no, we realise that. That's fantastic. Thanks ever so much. How many people were you thinking you might need to train, over what period of time, etc.? And ultimately, they gave us nothing to go with at all that might be of interest to us in terms of how we might be able to reshape a deal. And the reliance was solely on this sort of sense of you'll be kind of, overawed or wowed by the brand, which fantastic. Please don't get me wrong. It's lovely to get a great brand, but ultimately you haven't told me anything. And sometimes that's a strategic decision. There are organizations it is a given rule that they will share no volume, no anything. And I will respect that. But you've got to understand that makes it really difficult to drive a really good deal out if you're not actually going to bring anything to the table that they actually want. Or is it sometimes out of fear, out of I haven't prepared, I don't know. But I just worry that we don't go to the table armed with the thing that the other side, the very reason that they are there is for you to say, this is what I might have. But I'm going to say, no, I'll keep it quiet and you can guess, but give me a great deal.
It's interesting. It almost sounds in that instance, Annabel, like you went to the table ready to negotiate. They came armed with persuasion. We're 100%. Huge. You've got to love working with us. This is what we want. And I think sometimes there is that kind of people's view of being prepared is being prepared in terms of what persuasive tools am I going to bring to the table? Have I got a sufficiently strong piece of persuasion that will knock them out the park, that will make them go, oh gosh, now you explain to me like that, where can I sign?
Yeah.
And so there's maybe, and there certainly is a place for persuasion, but I think there's also a need to recognize when that persuasion isn't working. When you're saying to this big brand, we hear that and that's all great, but in order for us to demonstrate any flexibility, we need to actually see what we're getting back in return for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it always it surprises me, and I quite enjoy it. Like quietly, sort of have a little smile to myself and try to cover it. The amount of times people reference different negotiating techniques and strategies, it's like, no, that's actually all persuasion. That is just another way to go about persuading. And I'm sure we'll probably do another episode another time and like dig deeper into the difference, or, you know, when persuasion works, when it doesn't, and things.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that I just, as you're saying this, I'm reflecting back the times when persuasion was the predominant factor was either they were unskilled or they was relying on their power in the market and their positioning, and they felt that we don't need to bring much else to the table because you'd be privileged to work with us, was something I definitely dealt with in negotiations. Like, yeah, but we are whatever, insert name, and that was it, and holding the cards back and making you work for it because you'd be privileged to have your name on a contract with us, sort of thing, you know. That is their preparation. Preparation is to say the name of the company
Over and over again.
until the other person is groveling.
The other thing that I see good preparation doing, which is really helpful, is making people more confident about negotiating. And I do think that sometimes just that constant iterative persuasion is sometimes rooted in almost a lack of confidence about their ability to negotiate. You know, we're not sure if we're well enough prepared. We're not sure if we're empowered in the organization to negotiate. So we'll just go in and keep repeating the same stuff over and over again in the hope that we'll eventually wear them down and they'll agree to all of our demands. So, you know, as apart from preparation, leaving people empowered enough to create richer deals, it also builds confidence to negotiate, to move out of the preparation if it's not effective and move into negotiating. But if I haven't done that kind of preparation work to negotiate, then all I've got is preparation. Keep saying our brand is brilliant, you want to work with us.
Yeah. And if I was to add, you know, beyond the sort of the brand piece or the sort of the size piece, is also, that's very often the preparation is rooted in logic and data and reason, which, please, you know, I take nothing away from that. 100% you should have all of that. But again, there's an over reliance on the facts, and it's kind of, well, as we've seen over recent years, there's always a truth and an alternative truth to these things. But even if I've got logic, there comes a point very often with the data where the answer may simply be, yes, I hear you, but so what? I'm not prepared to accept that logical argument, or more often, it's not in my commercial interest to accept your piece of logic. Or even if you say to me, I can refute that piece of logic, well, that's okay, but I'll go out of business if you don't take the price increase. What do you do then? And I think that's the other piece that we have to look at. Persuasion is very often rooted in all the logic, etc. But then it's the piece beyond that as well. So don't just limit yourself to the great argument per se, because again, back to your point about flexibility, what about when I get pushback on that? But again, I think if you are, it's one of those things as well to be aware of the kind of either the industry or your natural tendency or your mindset. That is, if you are logic driven and very, as opposed to sort of intuitively perhaps kind of geared, then it's really hard to accept that piece of persuasion isn't perhaps working, and that you would need to have a plan B to that. And it's almost, there's an extra piece of self-awareness in there that I think it is really helpful to bring to the table.
Then the tendency is to just reiterate that piece of persuasion that wasn't successful, and the other side start to become really irritated. So If we were to think back to, I'm just thinking about anybody listening to this in terms of kind of nuggets to take out of this conversation around, what advice would you give your younger self to be, what piece of advice? That's kind of one key piece of advice you would give your younger, more naive self that would make you a better prepared to negotiate. I know for me, it's about creativity. It's about thinking around what other variables might have a value to them and might have a value to us so that we can build a richer deal.
Yeah, definitely. For me, the creativity piece for sure, finding value in other ways, starting to think outside the box. But also, I think something that would have been hugely beneficial would be to have a, a bigger list of really powerful questions to ask. And to be honest, I did always used to try to prepare like 3 or 4 questions. I was thinking of that sort of thing, but actually 3 or 4 I think doesn't hit the mark, because I would kind of have the same sort of standard questions whatever the negotiation was, but actually having powerful questions that test assumptions, that like try to understand or ascertain what are the limit positions, which aspects of this deal aren't working, what aspects would work, what is their priority, and various other questions that go beyond those initial questions, would have definitely allowed me to really hear the other side. And I think what I was doing, like definitely in the first few years, is I was basically asking a few questions to go, how can I shove my peg? That sounds really well. Where's that phrase? How can I make, that saying, they fit a peg in the hole? But how can I make my proposal fit
Square peg
what
fit
you
around
want?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And actually, it's like I realized it was asking those questions with a bit of I was like being blind. I was listening to the answer, like, how are you going to fit what I want? How are you going to fit what I want? Rather than actually just literally listening, because I was really just filtering out anything that suited me and ignoring everything else. So more powerful questions and listening to all of the answer, not just the bits of the answer that suited me.
Yeah, I
What
agree.
about you, Annabel? What would you?
Well, I of course agree with both of those, and but I think perhaps building on what Siobhan just said, it is that curiosity. If I was to say engender 2 traits, it would be creativity and it would be curiosity, and genuine curiosity. Genuinely trying to understand what is happening I really need to stop waving my thumbs about. I would just that, to ask a question, but then to ask another question, and then the question underneath the question, and tell me a bit more about that. And I quite often I was almost sum it up if I'm teaching sometimes, to say, when you hear something, it's almost stopping your first instinct to be, let me tell you why that's wrong, or let me tell you my view on that, or let me tell you something, because that's not that helpful. It's my first instinct, but I hadn't thought of it that way, or tell me a bit more about, or why is it that you think that? And I think sometimes that comes about from having the confidence to know, back to the creativity and the flexibility. It's kind of, well, I'll take on board what you're saying, because I'm not trying to railroad through one proposal. So it doesn't matter if we deviate for a minute, because I can stop and understand that, and I might get so much more insight from that. So for me, it would be trying to nurture that curiosity as a negotiator. And I think, I look back, and you go back to your first kind of sales training and the folder, and out you go, and you're itching to kind of deliver everything. And it does take that extra level of confidence to sort of think, no, it'll be okay if I stop talking for a minute and let you talk. And I think that balance where you hear even more than you say should be that sort of standard that you aspire to.
Yeah. It's interesting. Just building on that, I ran a course for a client recently, and they were saying they wanted, I was asking what did they want people to take away? How did they want people to be different after the course? And the stakeholder said to me, I want them to think about the second layer. I said, what do you mean the second layer? And he said, I want them to think about not just what's said at the table, but what lies behind what's said. And I actually really like that, this idea of, asking a question, not just paying lip service to, I've got to ask a question, so here's a question, but really genuinely, tell me a bit more about that. Help me understand why that's important to you. Find out what's driving what they're presenting to you. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, I had a really splendid example of that some years ago now, where I was asked to go and consult on a deal, because basically this was with the buying side of the contract we were trying to achieve, who just couldn't get the sellers to budge. They wanted a sizable price decrease on a very expensive commodity, which they considered themselves to be major players in that marketplace. We were talking about a precious metal. They were going to buy a huge amount of it in their eyes, and therefore wanted a considerable discount off this. As I joined the action, as it were, they'd made one proposal for a discount and been met with a blanket no. They'd gone back and made a further proposal, which they embellished much more. They said, yes, we went back and then we made them this massive slide deck proposal. And eventually, when we discussed it and said, well, why do they keep rejecting it? I said, well, I don't know. He said, well, have you asked them? No, we haven't. Have you asked them anything? No, basically not. They went back, asked the question, why are you rejecting the proposal? And they said they actually didn't want more volume from them. They saw them as they weren't the biggest player in the marketplace, and they wanted to reduce the amount of business that they did with them, and they certainly didn't want to discount it. That's not to say a deal wasn't going to be done, but it wasn't going to be done on the terms that the buyers considered it, because their assumptions were entirely wrong. But until we stopped and actually tested and asked a few questions, and that particular deal had a lot of noughts on the end. And you kind of think, well, isn't that the first thing you'd want to find out? Is the world as I think it is, I guess, is my point of view. But it was fascinating, really fascinating.
Yeah. There's a lovely quote that I use on the course, which I really like. The Dalai Lama, who says, if I'm talking, I'm only repeating something I already know. If I'm listening, I have the chance to learn something new.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, and listening to seek to understand, not listening under sufferance, waiting for the other side to keep quiet so you can jump in with what you want to say next, which is what so many people do. But really that listening to try and understand. So asking questions in that instance, Annabel, like, why are you rejecting my proposal? Help me understand what the problem is. And then really listening to the answer rather than coming back in with a bit of persuasion as to why they think the other side should accept the proposal.
Yeah. It's interesting as you say that, because it kind of strikes me that somebody might be listening and thinking, well, are you really talking about preparing if you're talking about asking lots of is that actually preparation? But I think it loops right back into the point you made, Anne, about if I'm confident that I've built in enough flexibility, I'm confident enough to not have to control every last sentence of this negotiation in case you take it somewhere I don't want to go. And so it's by baking in enough flexibility I can afford to do that. I know what I think I need, but the purpose of me going engaging with you is to try and find out whether I stand a chance of getting it and on what terms I might get it, or whether I need to deviate. And I do think that requires a degree of confidence, but I think that confidence is rooted in that sound preparation that you've done in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. And having that time to just be creative and like you said, baking the flexibility and understanding how can I position and ask different questions to ascertain which of these various options will be better, rather than just going, this is how it's going to be, and I might shift a little bit on the discount or the volume, which unfortunately is what lots of people do. And kind of in contrast to that, one thing I would say is I know there was a company that I worked with for a period where it was like, let's just wing it. Like, we know what we offer. We know the sort of package we provide. We know there's this mid-range. If they can't afford that, we give them the lower tier. And if they're a big player, there's this upper tier that's, bells and whistles option. And we go in there, wing it, have a conversation, ask some questions, see what they say. It was always, let's see what they say. Just like the phrase you'd always hear before you walk into the meeting, and they'd repeat it again as we go into the building. It was quite comical, really. But that was the approach. But having said that, there are times when it worked for them. And I would say, if you're in a situation where you literally can't prepare, or you're being pulled in to help on a colleague's negotiation and you haven't been dealing with that case for a long time, or you take over somebody's workload because they're suddenly off of work and you know your schedule's far too tight, that questions have saved me in those moments. Just taking longer to ask the questions and in a way that you just get the other side communicating with you about their priorities, about what matters most to them. And with powerful questions, it will open people up in a way that if you just ask them directly, right, what's most important to you, which thing is going to be the cruncher for this deal, they might not tell you. But if you can phrase it in a much more powerful and sophisticated questions, you can get so much information that can help you navigate if you don't prepare, though we'd always encourage preparation.
Well,
if not,
it's bound to happen now and again that you get caught on the hop with a phone call, etc. It's funny that you say that about the questions might save you, and again, I think there's a confidence to being able to ask questions and not feeling you need to control the agenda. And I heard it summed up beautifully by it was told to me by a group that I was working with, who said that their CEO, I met him, a very, very charismatic gentleman who very confident in his approach to the world. And when they would go to him, or a supplier would go to him, or a partner would go to him, and he might say to them, no, tell me again in crayon. And I think that's the most gorgeous question, like basically saying, I don't mind that I don't understand it, or you tell it to me in crayon. And I've used it a few times since I heard of it. I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Yeah,
give me the simple version. Why
that
not?
nicely links back to the assumptions part too. Like, don't assume somebody will understand at that level of complexity, and feeling confident enough to say when you're not quite clear on something. Or sometimes some people's proposals just come across so complicated, or they're full of so many numbers and figures, or the way they've communicated it hasn't been clear. And it might make sense to do with their KPIs. That the amount of times I've gone to negotiation and I've worked with colleagues, it's been like, this makes sense because of how we break down our costings. But to the other party, we're speaking a totally different language and they don't get how this translates for them. We have to think about how this is landing for them, not just how we break it down for our profit margins.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes right back to where we started with, which is saying when you prepare, don't make it all about your side of the table. What does the world look like on their side of the street? Why might they be interested, and how would they want to talk to you? I sometimes say you've got to decide what the currency of the negotiation is. You might want to talk about it, in buckets, and they might want to talk about it in spadefuls. I don't know, a silly example, but it's very easy to drive your own position again. And actually, there's then double processing going on the other side. Well, they're sort of translating everything into the language that they want it to be in. Whereas, again, it might be a really collaborative thing to do, to say, how do you want to discuss this? How would it work, for us to construct this deal to work for you? And you would imagine that would be more well received, better received on the other side of the table if that were the case, again, rather than it must be as per my KPI sheet, to use your point, Siobhan.
Yeah, 100%.
The other thing that I come across quite often is people in preparation not analysing the information that's available to them and asking themselves, what should I share with the other side? And kind of how soon should I share it? I was just thinking, we were talking about preparation. I did some work years ago with a pharmaceutical company whose objective was to reduce trade spend by X amount with their wholesalers. And we put them in pairs. So it was a group of 12 in 6 pairs. And we said, right, I want you to imagine that you're face to face with the other side. Off you go, have the conversation. And for 20 minutes, there was only one group out of the 6 groups that actually mentioned reduction in trade spend. So they'd spent 20 minutes not actually telling the other side why they'd called the meeting. And I think that the problem with not kind of being clear about what is it we want, what information do we need to share, and when are we going to share it? If you don't think about that, then it can just kind of get left till much later in the discussion. And then, of course, it's not perceived as particularly credible by the other side. You think, well, if that's what they wanted, surely they would have told us that earlier on. So I think there is a piece in preparation about looking at information, deciding what's appropriate for me to share and when am I going to share it. So,
I completely agree. Sometimes think, it links into how you open and this kind of
yes.
idea of being more influential, and it is intertwined with persuasion, because it is all in there in terms of conditioning and maybe trying to shift the view of where the deal's going to happen or how the relationship's going to run. And I think, as you say, the sooner you can share that, the better. And yet, so often the sense I get from people is that so and so person X is a great negotiator because they tell the other side nothing. Well, anybody can do that.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in what filter they apply to that and how they're making those decisions about what they share, if you like. So, I 100% agree with you. And sharing something early and understanding why you're sharing it. And we often say to people, just try and distill down into a single sentence why you're at the table.
Yeah.
And then it's worth thinking, well, how do I convey that to the other side? I might not tell it to them in the same words, but how do I share enough of why we're there to make some kind of sense of the conversation? Because I'm sure I haven't just turned up for a chat and a day out. I'm sure there's some purpose to me being there. So it's not unreasonable to have that. But I think there's that sense of I weaken my power if I tell you why I'm here. Well, I'm a lifelong salesperson. So if I've turned up, because the purpose is I'm trying to see if I can sell you something and you want to buy it. So I don't need to pretend that I'm not there. Is that? I don't think that's unreasonable.
If you think about, if people can't distill down into a single sentence or two sentences why they're at the meeting, it begs the question, how likely is it that the other side is going to have any sense of why they're at the meeting either? So, I think that clarity is important, again, for building confidence. But just for kind of setting an agenda at the start of the meeting that everybody is kind of bought into. I mean, maybe from different perspectives, but we are here to talk about X.
100%. And sharing that early on is so important, because as we're saying this, I'm thinking of a negotiation I was in where we had such different objectives. We were coming to the meeting to do the same thing, but we were really in it for such different reasons. We were looking for a 3-year contract and we wanted exposure to a certain level of the database. The other party just wanted to demonstrate that they were doing a 3-month trial period to utilize part of their budget to show that they were, taking actions to move forwards on something that had been deemed as important. They weren't interested in a 3-year plan at all. So, it's when you get clear on the objectives, you can see, is this going to work at all, or how do we reposition? Because sometimes people aren't forthright in that, and then, you're speaking about totally different things without realizing.
Well, I was having a smile to myself because if both sides apply the strategy of, well, let's turn up, see what they say and take it from there, it's going to be possibly the world's lamest meeting. Somebody's got to go.
So if any listeners have any good stories or any entertaining stories, or maybe even a moment where you triumphed or failed when it came to negotiating, maybe you prepared really well and the outcome was far better than you expected, or maybe you failed to plan, and let us know what happened. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions around preparation or assumptions or more of the topics we've been covering, please do send it in.